thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many people here that are really excited to learn more about sea otters in Oregon and the next steps to reintroduce them. My name is Ian John Carlo, and I am the Oceans Advocate with Environment Oregon. Many of you might be Environment Oregon members, so you may already know that we are a statewide environmental advocacy group, which, alongside our thousands of members in the state, really envision a greener Oregon, one that celebrates special ecosystems where nature can thrive and really values incredible wildlife like sea otters, for example. Here with me tonight is Chanel Hayson, who is the Director of Outreach and Community Relations with the Alaka Alliance. And over the next hour, you'll learn more about sea otters, the consequences our ocean has endeavored without them, and what's being done to bring them back. After Chanel's presentation, which will probably be around 40 to 45 minutes, we'll have time for you to ask questions using the Zoom chat function. So if you just want to direct message us after the presentation ends, that would be fantastic. So if you could hold those questions off until then, that would be great. And again, a huge thanks to Chanel and the Alaka Alliance for helping with this event. And with that, I think, Chanel, you can kick it off.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. Thanks for also the great introduction, Ian. So my name is Chanel Hayson, and I am the Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the Alaka Alliance. And you can remember our nonprofit name by saying Boom Shaka Alaka. Kids love that one. So today I'm going to kind of discuss sea otter reintroduction in Oregon and what are the next steps and kind of what led to their demise and hopefully their return soon. So firstly, I'm going to discuss the sea otter history here in Oregon, their biology, and a little bit about the kelp forest ecosystem here. And then I'll discuss a little bit about the Alaka Alliance and our next steps to reintroduction. So, timeline of sea otters in Oregon. About 2 million years ago, they evolved near modern-day Russia, and it eventually expanded their population across the North Pacific all the way from Baja California to Japan. So a huge range. And then about 10,000 years ago, Native Americans arrived to the Pacific Northwest, and tribes and sea otters thrived amongst one another. There are a lot of modern-day places in Oregon, like Otter Rock and Otter Point, that are named after sea otters. So we know they were present along our coastline, and also we have bones found in shell middens along the Oregon coast that showcase both northern sea otters and southern subspecies sea otters were both along the Oregon coast in the past. And then around the mid-1700s, started the maritime fur trade. Russian mariners, English, and some Americans came to this region and started hunting and trading for sea otter pelts, as you can see there demonstrated. They were quite large, and they're also extremely soft. They were known as soft gold, and so people made jackets and hats out of them, and unfortunately, that led to their demise. And there's a Coos Bay article from 1910 that was the last evidence we've seen of Oregon's original sea otter population, and that pelt was sold for about $500, which was enough money to buy a house with acreage back then, so that is a lot of money. It was known to be the most valuable pelt in the entire world. But thankfully, some pockets did survive the fur trade. So there was small pockets that remained in Alaska near Prince William Sound and some across the Aleutian Islands. And then there was a tiny isolated population off the coast of California in Big Sur. And so every Californian sea otter right now is a southern subspecies sea otter that came from that tiny isolated population that survived the fur trade. So populations today in yellow are where sea otters are currently present. So they're off of Japan and across Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, and then across Oregon and much of Northern California. There's about an 800-mile gap where their native range used to be, that there are no longer any sea otters. So we are trying to close that gap. So speaking about sea otters in Oregon, there are only two places where you are guaranteed to see sea otters here in our state. Does anybody know those two places? You can use the chat feature. This video is from one of those places. Hint, hint. Well, nobody. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Doe said the Oregon Coast Aquarium in Newport. That is correct. And Joyce said the Oregon Zoo, and that is correct too. So those are the only two places that currently have sea otters in captivity, because we have 0 on the Oregon coast in the wild. So thankfully we have two places where we can view them, and they are ambassadors to the species, so we can learn more about them. People can get excited and also educated that sea otters are not present on our coastline and the reasons why. We work very closely with both those institutions. We're very lucky. So let's talk about sea otters and river otters and what the difference is, because I get tons of emails throughout the year of people saying, oh, I just saw a sea otter. It was running along the beach in Oregon, or I saw it swimming up a river, and 100% of the time that has been a river otter. So if you ever think you see a sea otter off of the Oregon coast, be sure to take pictures or videos and email us, and I can tell you if that is actually sea otter. But most of the time it is a river otter. River otters den on land, so all 4 paws, that's kind of the biggest way to tell the difference, is river otters have 4 paws that are all the same size. So they can run and dig along the coast, on beaches and on riverbanks. And sea otters have those big back flippers, and that helps them in the water because that's where they live 99% of their whole entire life. So if you ever see a sea otter on land, if you go to the zoo or aquarium and see them haul themselves out, they are extremely awkward. So they are not agile on land. So if you see something running on the beach, that is definitely a river otter. Also, sea otters are quite larger. They're about 50 to 100 pounds, and river otters are smaller. River otters often are seen also near docks and piers. When people throw fish overboard, they eat that. Sea otters don't want to be near people, so they will back off. But anyway, if you have any questions about the differences, let me know. I have a lot to cover today. So sea otters are eating machines. They eat about 25 to 30% of their body weight each and every day. So 70-pound sea otter needs to eat about 20 pounds of food every single day. So that is also a reason why they eat about 100 different animals in the ecosystem. So ranging from crabs, clams, mussels, octopus sometimes, sea slugs, all those fun things. And so each diet, a cool fun fact, each diet varies between individuals. So it's basically what their mom taught them how to hunt and eat is what they usually will also do as well. So I just made a social media post about this last week that kind of went viral, which is really neat. But sea otters definitely are what they eat. So they can eat so many purple sea urchins that it actually turns their bones purple, and sometimes their teeth as well. And this is called echinochrome staining, and it occurs when they eat a copious amount of purple sea urchins. And so this photo is just really cool. It's from the Morro Bay State Parks. They found a sea otter that washed ashore and its skull was stained purple. And so this photo is after they dipped it in water to kind of really showcase that purple color, but it really is solid purple. Some other fun facts about sea otters. So they have these short, blunt skulls, as you can see there, and they actually have fracture-resistant teeth. So that is super helpful when you're eating lots of hard-shelled invertebrates like clams and crabs and urchins, because they never have to go to the underwater dentist because their teeth don't crack. Haha, pretty neat. And they also have a giant bite force compared to their little size. They have the bite force the same as a black bear, about 80 pounds. So don't ever, ever, ever try and pet a sea otter in the wild. You shouldn't do that anyway, but they could really take off your finger in a quick second. So without blubber, most marine mammals have blubber, which is just a nice layer of fat that keeps them warm in cold waters. Like sea lions, seals, whales all have blubber. Sea otters are one of the only marine mammal that actually lacks blubber. So in cold waters, how do you think they stay warm? And that is their fur. Thanks, Wendy. It's always hard when I can't see people's videos and stuff. So I just want to make sure that you're interacting too. So yes, their fur, they have about 600,000 to 1,000,000 hairs per square inch. And if you just make the OK symbol with your hand, that O is about 1 square inch. So think of 1,000,000 hairs in that one little area. So it's super dense. And something cool about their fur is that they actually have 2 layers of fur. They have a bottom layer and a guard layer. And so they're constantly grooming whenever you see them in the wild because they're trying to put a pocket of air between those 2 fur layers, which is actually what keeps them insulated and warm. So whenever they dive down for food, you'll see all these bubbles leaving their fur, and that's basically their warmth leaving them. So when they come back to the surface, they have to make sure to keep grooming themselves more. This one's always a fun one. So a lot of times people know about sea otters is that they have pockets. Not really, but they have a lot of extra skin in their armpits. And so when their stomach is also their dinner table, they need some place to store their rocks or some extra clams like this sea otter here. And so they just stick it in their armpits as a kind of a little safe haven. It's always fun to watch. So we know sea otters are in kelp forest marine ecosystems, which I'll dive into in a little bit, but they also benefit estuary habitats as well. And so in a recent study in the Elkhorn Slough in Monterey Bay, and if you're not familiar with the Elkhorn Slough, up that river is a lot of agricultural land, so that runoff is usually not the most clean. And so the Elkhorn Slough didn't have super clear water. And then a researcher realized over time that that water kept getting cleaner and clearer. He's like, why is that? And so it's basically thanks to sea otters that were reintroduced there. And so in the eelgrass ecosystem, there are crabs. And these crabs kind of overpopulated when sea otters were not present. And so they ate a lot of sea slugs and snails. And those sea slugs and snails eat algae that grows on the outside of eelgrass. So just kind of like a plant that needs sunshine. When there's a cover on that eelgrass, it can't photosynthesize and grow. So that's bad. And so when sea otters came along, they ate the crabs, controlled that population, which allowed the sea slugs and snails to do their job and eat the algae that was growing on the eelgrass. Thus, the eelgrass could photosynthesize and reproduce and make that ecosystem better. And so there's a lot of moving parts there. So hopefully that made sense. But so it really showcased that sea otters are really crucial in the estuary ecosystem, keeping balance of the crab population. And if you've never been to the Elkhorn Slough, thanks, Wendy, the Elkhorn Slough Safari, when you go out and you can kind of tour all the animals in the ecosystem, is really fantastic. There's so much beautiful life there. And so sea otters and estuaries help decrease erosion by 70%, a new study that just came out this year. So with better eelgrass habitat and with sea otters actually going down and digging for clams, that helps the eelgrass repopulate and grow and expand. And so their roots down into the sediment help decrease erosion. So it's really fantastic. And it's also a great habitat for juvenile fish and a great habitat for migratory waterfowl as well. And it also stores carbon. So sea otters are a keystone species. So this means that the role in the environment has a greater effect than any other species. And as top predators, they're crucial to maintaining the balance of nearshore ecosystems, such as kelp forests and estuaries. Now we know that. And without sea otters, sea urchins can overpopulate the seafloor and devour kelp forests that provide cover and food for many other marine animals, which now I will kind of discuss that whole aspect. So let's talk about kelp forests. This is a beautiful way to introduce you to this amazing ecosystem. This was filmed in Monterey Bay from my friend Patrick Webster. It's actually his birthday today. Happy birthday, Pat. And so kelp forests are one of the most diverse ecosystems in the ocean, and kelp itself is an ecosystem engineer. So just by growing, it's providing kind of, a whole habitat for all of these different species, from other algae to invertebrates to marine mammals, fish, everything amazing lives in this ecosystem. And it's important for communities because it protects our shoreline from coastal erosion, having this habitat off of our coast. So it's a really beautiful and amazing and diverse ecosystem that we should all want to protect. So let's talk about kelp in Oregon. We have 99% of all the kelp off our coast is bull kelp. So it kind of looks like the tail of a bull. And so the parts of the kelp, it's a large brown macroalgae. So it's not a plant, although it kind of looks like one. They have something called holdfast. So that's what sticks to a rocky, hard substrate. And then the long stipe goes up to the surface where there's a floating gas bulb. And then from that, there's about 30 to 50 blades that come off of that. And that's what the kelp uses to photosynthesize and grow. We do have a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of giant kelp off our coast. Most of that is off of Cape Arago in Coos Bay. But I did find some last weekend doing a beach cleanup in Oswald West State Park. So now I'm curious. I need to talk to a kelp person to figure out where that came from. So why should you care about underwater forests? As I kind of mentioned previously, they help protect our shorelines because they lessen the currents and big storm surges and waves. They are great habitat for larval fish and crabs to grow. They also help feed lots of marine mammals. And it also helps capture and store carbon, which helps thus fight climate change, which is super big. So kelp removes tons of CO2. It's so, let's see. It can sequester about 20 times more carbon per acre, kelp forest can, than land forests. So that's pretty huge difference. So I know, not everybody can just jump in the water and look at a kelp forest every day. Unlike here in Oregon, we're lucky to have beautiful forests just at our footsteps, land forests. So I'm trying to tell you that the kelp forests are really, really crucial, even though you don't actually see it all the time. It's doing amazing things for us, and it also provides a lot of our oxygen on the planet too. And so how does it sequester carbon? I like this little graphic because I'm a visual learner, so hopefully you appreciate it as well. But kelp sequesters carbon dioxide from doing photosynthesis as it grows. And then when it gets dislodged from a rocky substrate, it floats out with their float down and sinks to the bottom of the seafloor to be trapped forever. And so all that carbon that it absorbed will just be trapped on the bottom of the seafloor. So kelp is also super helpful for animals above the water too. Not only us, but also seabirds that like to munch on all the tasty things that grow in the kelp forests, as well as other birds that benefit from dead kelp. So nothing is wasted in nature, even when something is deceased. It also benefits the ecosystem. So when kelp washes ashore, there's lots of insects that gravitate towards that, and lots of shorebirds eat those insects, and even predatory birds like peregrine falcons and eagles benefit from that as well. And so large megafauna like gray whales, which we have migrating currently along the Oregon coastline, feed in kelp. They eat the little tiny things called mysid shrimp. And so it's really crucial that we have healthy kelp forests, not only for all the animals that live in it, but all the animals that need to feed because of it. So unfortunately, we have a totally shifted ecosystem over the last several decades, and kelp forests have declined quite drastically. So let's kind of talk about that. So with sea otters being absent for the last century off of the coastline here in Oregon, we had these huge sea stars called sunflower sea stars off of our coast in the kelp forests. And they've been helping control the sea urchin population while sea otters have been absent, which is great. Until there was something called the blob. So this is the West Coast, and the ocean was increased about 3 degrees Celsius in temperature. So it went super high, which may not seem like a lot to us, but to a small invertebrate that depends on cooler ecosystems, that is a huge change. And so unfortunately, 99% of the whole sunflower sea star population collapsed with this disease. They kind of just started melting apart. And so thankfully, though, some sea star species have rebounded, like the ochre sea star off of our coast, but there still hasn't been quite that much of a rebound from that decimation of the sunflower sea stars. And so this is what is occurring along much of the West Coast currently, is that without these two predators in the marine ecosystem, we have sea urchins that don't have any predators for the most part. And so they're just overpopulating and taking down kelp forest ecosystems kind of really quickly. And so nothing is keeping them in check. So this is kind of a good photo evidence of what they're called like purple carpets or urchin barrens, is when urchins kind of take out an entire kelp forest and all you see is just a purple carpet of urchins. So we have two main sea urchins here in Oregon, and that's the purple sea urchin, as I mentioned, and we also have red sea urchins. So purple sea urchins, if you make a fist, they're about the size of your hand in a fist. And if you open up, that is about the size of a red sea urchin. So reds are a little larger. And scientists have found that red sea urchins can live up to 200 years, which is wild, but they could actually live longer. We only just found one that was 200 years old, so we don't know exactly how long they live for, but they never stop growing. They grow very slowly, about 1/100 of an inch per year after they reach adulthood. What they eat, obviously kelp, we talked about that, other algae and decomposing creatures. Those things are not on my dinner plate, but I'm glad that they are eating it. And yeah, so that's kind of a quick little summary about the urchins that we have here. So there is something called zombie urchins, a term that's going around right now talking about kelp forests. And so that is, so sea urchins are kind of like the worst invertebrate to not have predators because they can live for multiple years without ever eating anything. So they can go into kind of a dormant zombie state and just kind of travel along the sea floor waiting for something to fall down in its path or come to a kelp forest and start eating it. So this one is a healthy sea urchin on the left. And so all that yellow stuff are their gonads, or also called uni. If you eat sushi, that is what you're eating. And then these sea urchins here are considered zombie urchins. So they kind of just eat themselves internally from inside and have very, very minimal gonads. So let's talk about bringing them back to Oregon. So who's the Alaka Alliance? We are a small nonprofit organization here in Oregon made up of tribal and conservation leaders to help aid in the return of Oregon sea otter population back to their native waters. We were conceived and informally organized in 1999 by the late David Hatch, who you can see here on the left. He was a Siletz tribal member. And so he was naming a boat he was building with his son Peter and came across the word Alaka in a Chinook jargon dictionary, which led him down a path of activism and questioning scientists and researchers trying to figure out what happened to Oregon's sea otter population and why it was super crucial to bring them back to our coastline, and also bring back a family member to our coastal tribes. We are a small staff of 4 full-time staff members. 2 are in Portland area, and we have 2 on the South Coast. So our vision is an Oregon coast 50 years from now where our children and grandchildren can enjoy and benefit from a healthy sea otter population, a robust marine ecosystem, and a thriving coastal economy. This is a kelp forest off of Monterey Bay with some healthy bull kelp, and they have sea otters there. So this is kind of our dream vision. So let's talk about the why. What are reintroduction benefits? So ecologically, we already touched upon sea otters as a keystone species. And so restoration of this species within important gaps of its historical range is super important for especially the southern sea otter, which are only in California, and then the population in Washington and north are all northern subspecies sea otters. And so bridging that gap between the 2 subspecies where Oregon used to be a place where they intermingled would be really great genetically for the entire sea otter species. Culturally, as I mentioned, our coastal tribes for over 10,000 years had relationships with sea otters off of the Oregon coast. So it's part of their culture, and as I mentioned before, it's like bringing back a family member to their people. So it's really important to bring them back for that aspect as well. And socioeconomically would benefit our coastal communities through wildlife tourism is super huge. People love viewing sea otters. If you go to Monterey Bay, it's like the #1 tourist attraction, and brings in millions of dollars to them. And we just did a South Coast Tourism Impact Assessment last year, which is available on our website. And it estimated bringing in about $3.5 million a year to Oregon's southern coast just to bring sea otters back and reintroduce them. Also, there are other proven successful reintroductions in California. There are about 3,000 sea otters currently. In Washington, there is also about 3,000 sea otters after reintroduction there. And Alaska is the best place to view sea otters because they have the most in the world, about 70,000. So populations established through past translocation account for roughly 1/3 of sea otters in existence today and have successfully restored the species in many parts of its historical range. So that is awesome. So what are the challenges and considerations? So sea otters, the southern sea otters in California are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So if we were to reintroduce that subspecies, there is a special section called 10J, where the service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who would be actually doing the translocation, could authorize the release of endangered or threatened species outside of its current range, but within the historical range, upon finding that the release will further the conservation of the species. And then sea otters are also listed under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And so under that act, it specifically excludes the subspecies from the section of the statute that allows authorization of incidental take in the course of commercial fishing operations. And there's a lot of legal jargon I could throw at you, but if you have specific questions about this, I can send you some information. But there's just a little more red tape around bringing them back in terms of, you know, they accidentally got caught by a fishing vessel or something like that. Also have to take into consideration regulatory oversight. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service could be challenged by the community or offshore wind development, that kind of thing, state status. So let's see. So the sea otter is listed as a threatened species under the Oregon Endangered Species Act, and the Oregon Conservation Strategy identifies sea otters as a watch list species for rocky intertidal zones. And yeah, I'll say that's that. Sorry, I just want to make sure to get all the information correct. And political risk is obviously one. Sometimes some representatives don't want to get involved because it's touchy, risky topic. And costs. A reintroduction is very pricey for a time frame of 13 years based on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Feasibility Assessment of reintroduction in Northern California and Oregon. It would be an estimated cost of 26 to 43 million, which could cover 3 years of baseline assessments and 10 years of implementation and monitoring based on a range of plausible scenarios. So the how do we get to yes? We do lots of outreach and engagement. So that's where the Alaka Alliance thrives, is that we are a mechanism to educate the public and share why sea otters are super important to our marine ecosystem, why it's important that people know that we don't have any sea otters in Oregon, and why it's really crucial to bring them back for all the multitude of reasons I already touched upon. So that is what we are working on every year. Also gathering information, understanding the potential impacts, positive and negative, to the ecosystem and people, and continuing various research projects. So we are funding several projects right now, a shell fisheries impact assessment on the South Coast. So we're working with fishermen directly on that, and also we're funding shark research to understand where sharks are along the Oregon coast, and tagging them, and hopefully making sure there's no overlap where a potential sea otter reintroduction site would be off of our coastline. Gathering political support, which we are super thankful for Environment Oregon for helping with that, especially, and gathering public outreach and making sure elected officials know that their constituents want sea otters back in Oregon. And also we are working really closely with our tribal partners to make sure their voices are heard and understood. So that is really what we are focusing a lot of this year on, specifically at Alaka Alliance. So this is an excerpt from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Feasibility Assessment that was published last year. and basically summarizing that, yes, it is feasible to bring them back, that there are risks, obviously. Translocating a wild animal back to their native range is, there are some unknowns that can happen, but there's more studies that need to be completed to better understand that. And sufficient data cannot be collected until the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determines the specific reintroduction sites. So until they pick those sites, we'll have a better understanding of the impacts, both positive and negative. So what you should take away from this is that it is feasible to bring them back to Oregon from a biological and ecological perspective, and would produce conservation benefits to the species and the nearshore marine ecosystem, as well as a broad range of ecosystem services. Sea otter reintroduction is feasible. Oh, I just said that. Okay, that's it. So it is feasible, and I'll talk about. We published a feasibility study in 2022, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife that I mentioned before. They've published a feasibility assessment. Both of those documents can be found on our website if you want to visit that. And you can also purchase our feasibility study. It's a beautiful book, as you can see pictured there. I have several of those if you would like to purchase one. So if you want to stay connected on everything that we're doing in our research projects and our outreach and events, we have lots coming up in the next couple of months. So please join our newsletter. You can do so through our website, and I can put a link here in the chat. And we're across, every social media platform. So be sure to follow and like and all that good stuff. And if you ever interested in going on a deep dive of some more of our webinars and presentations with different researchers and scientists, our YouTube channel is excellent. And I want to say a thank you quickly to our partners. Obviously, we are an alliance, so it takes a lot of different groups working together to make a reintroduction happen and spread outreach across the state. So I want to give a shout out to all of these amazing groups. And now, wow, that was 5:40 on the dot. Nice. If you have any questions, I can see there are a couple in the chat already. Please feel free to put them there. All right. Let's see. Jeff says, in which remaining habitats are the largest and smallest sea otters found? Did hunting reduce the average sea otter size? Good question. So there's not really a big difference between the northern subspecies and the southern subspecies of sea otters. Although the southern subspecies found off of California are slightly smaller in size, and that may be that the waters off of California are slightly warmer than those found off of Alaska. But other than that, there's really not much difference between the two. Yes, we have an excellent several articles in the Oregon Historical Quarterly from fall of 2023. So if you want to take a look at that on their website, it is several of our board members are featured as authors in that. Can sea otters help control invasive green crabs? Lisa asks. Yes. Also, another bonus. Thanks. I need to add that to my presentation for the future. Yes, we have invasive green crabs on the West Coast, and sea otters down in Monterey Bay have been seen eating them. So we know that they do consume them. So that would be a bonus of bringing them back to Oregon too, is to control that green crab population. Do you need U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to help bring sea otters back? What can they do? Yes. So we wouldn't, Ilaka Alliance wouldn't be the ones doing the translocation. Sea otters, since they are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, this would all be the jurisdiction of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so they would be the ones to do basically everything. So yes, we need their help and their support. What would be different from this time from the previous attempt to reintroduce sea otters in the 1970s? Yes, so we did have a previous reintroduction of sea otters in Oregon in 1969 and 1970 through 71. And we have an excellent webinar on that on our YouTube channel from our board president, Bob Bailey, who did some incredible research for several months on understanding what happened during that translocation. And I don't, unfortunately, have a solid answer for you of why it didn't happen. They did survive for over a decade and did have pups and reproduce, but eventually they all kind of just disappeared. And best case guess I can give you is that they didn't reintroduce enough sea otters to withstand natural mortality rates and immigration that happens when you translocate a species. So a lot of them swam, trying to get back to where they came from. And so just over time, it just wasn't a large enough populations to keep it stable over time. But we did learn a lot. So, and that was, over 50 years ago. So we have a lot better methods of transport as well. Rosemary asks, why don't the sea otters naturally move both north from California and south from Washington into Oregon waters? Why is there a blank space? So sea otters aren't huge migrators in general. So sea otter moms, females have one pup a year and then they just continue, that cycle continues. So they don't really have a lot of free time to mosey about. We do sometimes have lone male sea otters from Washington that have been found off of the Oregon coast, usually washed ashore with a disease or they get bitten by a shark and that's fatal. But it's very rare. That happens about maybe like 5 times a year that they wash ashore. And so it's just not a likely way they can just repopulate a location, or else they probably would have by now. In California, they are so far south that to make a trip all the way to Oregon, if a lone male tried to do that, would probably be met with a lot of juvenile white sharks that are off of the coast of Northern California right now. So that is, let me preface with, white sharks don't eat sea otters, but when they are transitioning as juveniles from eating fish to marine mammals, sea otters from below kind of look like a nice fatty sea lion or seal that they do want to eat. And then they take a bite and get a mouthful of hair and nothing else, and then let go and then continue on their day. And oftentimes for that sea otter, that's fatal. So that is another reason why they're not in Northern California currently right now too. What happened to sea otters that were, oh, we already talked about that. What is the best way for everyday folks to help you and your efforts? Importantly, just spreading the word that sea otters are missing along the Oregon coast and have been for over a century is really crucial. About 90% of the people I interact with when I'm tabling at different events throughout the state don't even know that we don't have sea otters here because they see them at the zoo or the aquarium. So they just assume that they're out there in the wild. So that's really important, and that our kelp forests are being decimated by sea urchins right now. Is also something really important to talk about because kelp forests are huge ecosystems off of the coast that benefit not only us as humans with oxygen and food and helping with coastal erosion, but also for hundreds of species that depend on that entire ecosystem. So if that were to collapse, it would be horrible for all of us. Also, we are a nonprofit, so we do have a monthly donor program, $5 a month if you wanted to do that. Or we have some great merch on our website too, some t-shirts and hats and beanies and sweatshirts and all, and really cool artwork too. So all of that helps, all those purchases help us as well. And if you work for a company or you volunteer with another nonprofit and you have speakers, you can invite us to come speak and present and spread the word to your colleagues. That's also another great way. Is it true that sea otters are coming back to Baja, Mexico? So I think there have been a couple sightings of sea otters in Baja. So that used to be part of their native range. And I think scientists think that the San Nicolas Island reintroduction down in Southern California, maybe a couple of those sea otters swam south to Mexico. So they think that's probably the correlation there. Good questions, everyone. I think I got through all of them.
Yeah, I think that was all of the questions. I just wanted to do a final roll call for any additional ones. Um, so I'll give it like a minute or so. But Chanel, I just want to say I really appreciate you again taking the time to do this. I have seen many of the Alak Alliance webinars, and I have to say every time I hear about the cool fact about the pockets, I personally just love that. So that's my personal favorite, and I just get happy every time I get that. But
Yeah.
yeah, so does anybody have any final questions? I'll give it another couple seconds or so, but in the meantime, again, huge thanks to Chanel and the Alak Alliance for putting this together. This has been really great. I will be sending a follow-up email to folks that attended with my email, as well as um, Chanel's contact information as well, so that you can get in touch with us. Looks like I had one final question, actually, um, from my mom, actually.
I was gonna say, is that your mom?
It is my mom. So how does a sea otter chew or process the spines from the sea urchins? Chanel, do you
Good
want?
question. Yeah. So sea otters are one of the only marine mammals to use tools. So they use rocks most often to crack open all those hard-shelled invertebrates. So they'll crack open that urchin and eat their gonads and then toss the rest aside. So hopefully they don't bite through any spines. And somebody pointed out, well, if they're eating their gonads, that's orange. How are they turning purple in their bones? It's because they're also absorbing the chemical from the urchin itself that turns their bodies and their spines purple. So they don't necessarily have to eat those spines or their shells, their tests. Good question.
Well, I think that was the final question then. So I think we are good to close the webinar. And again, I'll be following up if folks have any additional questions. You can get in touch with us. So thanks again, everybody, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you.